This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Like many humanitarian crises, the situation in Sudan is complicated. The nation has a long history of violence, war, and genocide. Militia groups, factions, and tribes have contributed to the devastation. The region is facing mass starvation right now. 14 million people have been displaced, and 400,000 people have been impacted by famine. That's according to the United Nations. Mass killings and sexual violence are a common occurrence, and today we're going to take the time to unpack this conflict. Joining us now is Yanti Suripto, President and CEO of Save the Children, an international aid organization based in Fairfield, Connecticut. Yanti, welcome back to Where We Live.
Thank you for having me again, Catherine.
And also joining us is Arjan Heijenkamp, crisis lead for Sudan with the International Rescue Committee. That's a global humanitarian aid organization, and he's recently returned from North Darfur. Today, he joins us from Kenya. Arjan, thanks for being with us today as well.
Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live, or email us at wherewelive@ctpublic.org. And just another quick note that today we will be discussing sexual violence and trafficking this hour, so this show may not be appropriate for younger listeners. So Arjan, before getting into the current crisis, can you give us an overview of the history of this region? Because this is certainly not the first conflict that we've seen in Sudan.
No, for sure not. I mean, since independence, Sudan has lived through multiple phases of conflict. The big one that led to the separation of South Sudan from Sudan started in 1983. It eventually was concluded by the separation of South Sudan from Sudan. From that moment onwards, there was always the possibility of both conflict in South Sudan as well as in Sudan. And for sure, we've seen that happening over the past years. But 20 years ago, there was also conflict and fighting and displacement and mass killing in Darfur. The roots of this lie in the centralization of power in an elite in Khartoum that has basically disenfranchised the periphery and the people living in the periphery for a very long time. And combine that with military governance and a iron fist in rooting out any rebellion or any opposition. And basically, you have the root cause of the conflicts that we've seen over the past 40 years in the Sudan.
Well, you alluded to it a little bit just now, but the war in Darfur is something our listeners might be familiar with. There was a lot of attention on it between 2003 and 2005. But now, 20 years later, another civil war has enveloped the country. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, Darfur at that time, basically we see similar dynamics today, but in a different constellation. So at that time you had Arab tribes targeting African tribes in Darfur, dispossessing them of land, pushing them out of Darfur into Chad, neighboring countries, killing them, ethnically targeting them, and this was done at the time by the military government in Khartoum with the help of what was called the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed have since then transformed into what is called the RSF. They have stood up and started fighting their former masters, the Sudanese armed forces. And those are the two main protagonists in the conflict today. And RSF is controlling most of Darfur, with the Sudanese armed forces controlling most of the eastern part of the country.
Well, you just mentioned RSF, which is Rapid Support Forces. Could you explain what that is and how it was formed?
So the Janjaweed were Arab militias that were basically being used and paid for by the Sudanese armed forces about 20 years ago. They have subsequently formed into a paramilitary force with significant resources. They were used by not only the Sudanese armed forces, but also by the European Union in order to stifle and to stop immigration going to Europe. but also they've been used to fight in the war in Yemen. And so over time, they've gotten very, very powerful, very well resourced, and they're now basically the second most powerful force in the Sudan, and they control half of the country. And they continue to exercise violence in the same way that they did 20 years ago, most notably in the fall of Al-Fashar to RSF about 6 weeks ago now.
So it sounds like this is a group of forces that can basically withstand against the regular army of the country.
Yes, they are receiving outside help from outside forces. Most notably, the reports of the UN are pointing towards the United Arab Emirates, who seem to be a big supporter, and through whom they are getting financial support, but also military support. But previously, they've also worked as a paramilitary force under the Sudanese armed forces, and through that, they also got their own resources, their own equipment, their own weapons. And like I said before, the European Union in the distant past, they tried to use RSF in order to be able to stop migration happening from Eritrea, Ethiopia in particular, going through Sudan to Libya. And so they've accumulated a lot of power and a lot of weapons and a lot of money over time. And they're also trying to exploit the natural resources, notably gold, that is available in Darfur and elsewhere in Sudan.
Well, even with this brief overview of the history, over 40 years of history, we can clearly see there are so many different groups and factions, and each coming with its own complications. Is it harder to bring an end to this war and all the suffering because there are so many elements involved?
Yeah, because here we refer only to RSF and Sudanese armed forces, and those are two parties to the conflict. You have another military group called the SPLM North in the southern part of the country. You have SLA Abdul Wahid. You have a number of other splinter groups that are associated or affiliated with one or the other side of the conflict. And then you have a wide array of political groups within Sudan too. And this makes, so the Sudanese politics have always been very, very complex and complicated, and they have grown ever more so over time. And this is exacerbated by the fact that internationally, the countries that have a direct involvement and interest in Sudan have multiplied. Whereas when I was working in South Sudan 20 years ago, you had the Western countries and the US who exercised massive influence over the fate of the country and over the policies being pursued by the parties to the conflict in the country. Nowadays, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Turkey, you have Iran, you have Russia, you have the United Arab Emirates, in addition to the US, who have taken a bit of a backseat of late. And so you have a completely different international constellation making achieving peace or even a ceasefire, as we've seen recently, incredibly complicated.
And we mentioned at the top of the hour that sexual violence has become all too common in Sudan, and the UN recently reported that it's being used as a weapon of terror against women and girls. Could you unpack this for us?
Yeah, the war in Sudan has always been waged by attacking civilian life, livelihoods, social life, the tribes that are perceived to be affiliated with the other side. And so this is the main way that the war has been fought already for decades. And part of that, and notably on the RSF side, and previously with the Janjaweed, you had an instinct and a tendency or a routine of sexually assaulting women of whatever age. And this has continued until this day. It's a horrific element of the war. We are seeing it in North Darfur even today. If you walk through a camp of 650,000 displaced in Tawila, and if you start conversations with women, they're very, very open about the fact that they have been brutally and repeatedly raped en masse. And the fact that they're so open about it in a very conservative society is a signal that it is so widespread. It has happened to almost everyone. So yeah, it's a brutal and horrifying feature of this war, and it exemplifies, how much civilians are basically the prime target of the parties to the conflict. They're not just fighting each other; they're fighting through attacking the civilians, and specifically also women and children,
Well,
women and girls.
right, and you also mentioned how widespread it is and what a tactic it is to instill fear, because this is also happening to more men and boys.
It's also happening. We don't have that information so much. There's more of a taboo talking about it. We hear it once in a while. Where we hear it most is from women, and they speak about, and here we're talking about women that basically go from a young age of 15 up until an old age of 70. So it happens to almost everyone, and it is, particularly when Zamzam was attacked, a massive camp close to Afashir, where 500,000 people were living. It happened on almost a systematic basis, and more recently with Afashir being attacked and with people coming to Tawila, we hear it. I have colleagues talking to those women, and it's even hard listening to it. Imagine how it is for them to experience it or to see it happening to their children.
And Yanti, I want to bring you into the conversation. Yanti Suripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children, which is an international humanitarian aid organization based here in Connecticut. So Yanti, you've been hearing Ariane's experience and covered a lot just over the short overview just now. Anything you want to respond to, or what jumped out to you?
Oh, I think, just to double down, I think we see, and Save the Children has been in Sudan since 1983. We're there. We have a large team. We work in Darfur as is IRC. What I'm saying is, of course, is a symptom and a feature of most conflicts, right? What we see there, gender-based violence, rape for women and girls, often at a very young age, tends to sadly be the norm. But Arjen is right. In this particular instance, the reports that we hear coming out of places like Tawila and Al-Fashir are absolutely gruesome and horrifying. And I would say particularly the siege of Al-Fashir over the last number of weeks, where people were essentially trapped, hundreds of thousands of people were trapped in a town, which was then subsequently raided and raped, one would argue, are completely off, on a different level of extraordinary violence. I mean, I was particularly horrified to read, which was well published, I think, in a number of media, that if you look at it from space, from satellites, which some of our research colleagues have done at Yale, you could literally see discoloring of the soil where people had been massacred. So, it is that level of widespread, violence that is particularly gruesome in this case. And of course, not only is it horrifying what's happening to civilians there, it also makes our work as humanitarians harder, because our own staff and colleagues are also at risk of this violence and targeting.
Well, and on top of the risk and the violence, we have famine, which has officially been declared in this region. How is famine measured?
So there is a somewhat technocratic sort of method for it. The IPC is essentially an independent body which measures that. There's a whole methodology around it. There are 5 phases, and when, in Sudan, I think we have over 20 million people in IPC, what is called IPC phase 3+, 3 and up, 3, 4, 5, and then you're really talking about people being either close, at death's door because of starvation, IPC 5, to, really food insecure, skipping meals, coping mechanisms like sex for food, eating whatever they can get their hands on, animal feed, leaves, etc. So, I think the point here is always, the word famine always gets a little, it becomes a bit of a political thing around, is there famine, is there not famine? The point really is here, people are starving. There is not enough food, and there are millions of children who are currently in the phase of what is called acute malnutrition, which really means they're starting to waste away. And that not only, yes, it puts them at risk of starvation, but even if they can ultimately find food again, their cognitive and physical development might be hampered, because at young ages, if you miss that window, if you're severely malnourished, that really has an impact for life.
Well, you mentioned children being impacted here. Of course, what do we know about how the children of Sudan have been impacted during this conflict?
A sad feature of any conflict is that not only women experience this unbelievable violence, but children are usually bearing the brunt of all of this. They are the first to be starving. They have smaller bodies. They can withstand both violence as well as malnutrition less than adults. They are, particularly when there is displacement happening, as we've seen in Sudan, they're often at risk of being trafficked, of going missing, of losing their family and parents. So it is a huge child protection crisis, in a sense, this whole conflict.
Well, we mentioned earlier that 14 million people have been displaced in Sudan due to this conflict. And just to give our listeners a little perspective, that's nearly the same size as the entire population of New England. So when it comes to displacement, Yanti, could you describe what this looks like? Where are people being displaced to?
Well, we'll probably see, and Arjen will have some additional views on this. People are being displaced multiple times, first and foremost. So it's not just you live somewhere and then you move and then you stay there. Quite as we saw, the Zamzam camp, which was a huge camp where 500,000 people was also attacked, and then people get displaced again. So up they go. They pack whatever they have left, which is often the clothes on their back. And they pack up their children and family members, and then they try to move somewhere else where it is safe. Often that means walking, because of course there's very little transport, walking for hours in excruciating heat. And again, this is not a stable area. There is fighting everywhere. There's a number of militias, not just the two main warring parties. And there is just this, because of the unbelievable amount of weapons that are around, and absence of food, water, and shelter. What people do is that they grab a weapon, and so even displacement, the journey itself to a safer place, is incredibly dangerous for people.
Well, Arjan, we'd love to you to respond here, because you've been covering Sudan for decades. What have you witnessed when people are being displaced?
Well, I'll give you the example of Tawila. Tawila is a town which is, a small rural town about 70 kilometers away from Fasher. And it received, within 1 week, it received 400,000 people coming out of Zamzam when Zamzam was attacked in April. So talking about a mid-sized Dutch town that in 1 week basically has to pack up and go and travel through, like Yanti says, a very, very insecure intermediate area where there's militias roaming who are looting them, who are stealing from them, who are killing them, who are raping them on a very significant systematic scale. And then they arrive without anything on their backs, right, in Tawila. And Tawila is I was there 5-6 weeks ago. I will go there in 1 week time again. It's a massive camp of about 10 kilometers long. You see huts everywhere. People are living in makeshift reed huts. If they're lucky, if they're unlucky, basically they're living on the very same clothes that they came with and a couple of sticks. Water is minimally available because there's no water wells, and it's very, very difficult to drill there because it's a very mountainous area, or it lies next to a mountainous area, very far from the border of Chad. So people are surviving on 2 or 3 liters per person per day. They don't have any privacy in terms of they can't shower anywhere, they can't wash anywhere. The food is insufficient. There's clinics that are trying to do their best to cover the medical needs, but it's insufficient too. And so you see across the board basically a population of 650,000, which more recently the population from Al-Fasher has also been added to it, although not as many as we had expected. which we may come back to later. You see people in a massive need with very little support of a few international organizations, with the United Nations being generally absent from the area for political reasons. They just languish. They can't do anything else. They can't go anywhere else because everywhere else is insecure. They don't have any income. They can't take care of themselves much as they want to, and some do. So it's just an awful situation where we are trying to do the best we can, but we are not meeting even 50% of the total basic needs of that population.
Well, and Yanti,
it's good to add, Catherine, when you get displaced this many times and you are already hungry, your body weakens, right? Your immune system weakens. You're less able to withstand. So the absence of clean water then leads to waterborne diseases, communicable diseases, like we've seen cholera in a number of places confirmed, and organizations like ours try to treat it while we can, where we can, but as Arjen said, nowhere near to the scale that is really required. The humanitarian global appeal, which is in essence the UN saying this is what is required to reach these people in Sudan, which is already a reduced number because they don't expect the money to be raised. But even that lower number, I think, is only funded for about a third of what is required. So there's a huge absence of funding. And then there is a real issue of equal access, particularly across Darfur, because we've got these warring parties. Sometimes it's not safe to go somewhere. Sometimes organizations like ours are worried to go into an area that's occupied by one force for fear of being retaliated against if we then go to the other side, because warring parties are also using aid, assistance as a weapon of war here.
And so
withholding it from civilians is a way to essentially continue to terrorize the population.
Right. And because we're speaking of displacement, and with everything that's going on, trying to get to going from point A to point B or point C to E, F, G during this process. And before we go to break, I do want to touch on Yanti talking about Save the Children. A lot of the focus of your work is trying to reunify children with family members who separated during this process. How is that going? Could you describe what this work looks like?
Yeah, it is incredibly sensitive work. It is sometimes really invisible, right? If you deliver water or food to somebody, you're like, oh, well, we're delivering water and food. Reuniting very vulnerable children with their parents, or with, if there are no parents left or that is not safe, extended family or community, is incredibly sensitive. So you have to really do the work to understand where are they from. You have to do the vetting and the due diligence of, is that, are those people the right caregivers for these children, particularly when they're incredibly young, if you can imagine. So reunifying them is often the work of weeks or months. And then you have to monitor when children are reunified, whether that's going post-traumatic support that they have to be given, including the community, to then take care of the children, particularly when it's not their biological children. So yes, that is happening at scale in Sudan. We've done it for years, also in South Sudan, particularly when it comes to children who were essentially recruited by armed groups, child soldiers who will often spend years with armed groups. So to then reunify them and reintegrate them into their community to lead as much as possible a normal life, a childhood that they never had, is incredibly complicated.
With us for the hour is Yanti Suripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children, and Arjan Heijmkamp, who's with the International Rescue Committee. We will continue our conversation on Sudan and humanitarian crises across the globe when we return. You can join the conversation 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And before we go, a quick note. You may know that today is Giving Tuesday. It's a day nonprofits across the country ask you to support the causes you believe in, and that includes us. Where We Live relies on listener generosity for every episode we bring you, including this conversation on Sudan. And of course, your support is more important now than ever with Connecticut Public's recent loss of $2.1 million in annual federal funding. So please donate today. Visit our website at ctpublic.org. You can help make this Giving Tuesday a Giving Tuesday we'll never forget. And thank you all so very much. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. With us today is Yanti Suripto, President and CEO of Save the Children, which is an international humanitarian aid organization based here in Connecticut. And also here with us is Arjan Hehenkamp. He's a crisis lead for Sudan with the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian aid organization. And Arjan recently returned from North Darfur. And they are both here to help us unpack the ongoing humanitarian crisis unfolding in Sudan. So, Arjan, you recently spent time in Sudan. Could you tell us what your experience looked like there?
Yeah, so first of all, to get there is already a massive challenge. And so we have to travel from here to Chad. And then from Chad, you have to basically get a travel authorization from the authorities to go to the east of the country, all the way to the other side of the country. From the Chadian border, you enter into Darfur. If you want to go to Tawila, basically in the dry season, takes you minimum of 2 days driving through a very tough terrain, and including the Jebel Mara, which is incredibly mountainous. And I can tell you, if you're sitting in a car, you're jumping up and down the whole time, even if you're strapped in and you're holding yourself tight. And then you end up basically in a semi-desert area in Tawila, which is, like I said before, about 60, 70 kilometers away from what was very, very active fighting in Al-Fashir. And what you see is basically a region devastated by violence with an absence of any public services. So there's almost no schooling. Any of the clinics that are active are being supported by international organizations or national organizations. You see lots of fragmentation, division within Darfur itself. Some communities that are jealous of the assistance being provided to other communities, and that might create insecurity. Ultimately, you see a population that is, on the one hand, incredibly affected by this conflict. On the other hand, the Sudanese are incredibly strong themselves. They help themselves too. They have a massive community spirit. There are community groups that are providing support with a meager assistance that they get from international donors, and so the spirit and the strength of the Sudanese is amazing to behold, particularly and also within the camp setting that I described in Tawila, where evidently anyone who would live there would suffer. I would suffer massively. The Sudanese can hold up while supporting themselves and their family, and with the support that we are able to provide alongside them. It's a humbling experience, being there. I've worked in Sudan for about 30 years. I have a lot of admiration for the country. I have a lot of admiration for the people. It's just sad to see, the repeated tragedies that befall them without them being responsible for them, and without their country being, putting itself in a position whereby they will have better governance and better leaders that take care of the civilians in Sudan.
Well, and I want to get to your experience in the humanitarian aid missions, but I'm also curious to hear, because you just mentioned that you've been working there for 30 plus years and gaining so much reverence for the people there. And it's of course a huge tragedy that we are hearing this for decades. It's shocking. It's horrific. These are the images that we see for this country. But what do you see when you're there with the people, where a lot of their circumstances clearly are not within their control, but they are still trying to live their lives?
Yeah, there's this amazing example of what is being referred to in Sudan as the emergency response rooms. They have a particular history in the communal spirit of the Sudanese. They are self-organized. They were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't get it this time around. And they are an expression of Sudanese strength and resilience, and a willingness and ability to be able to help their neighbors and the people that they care about and the people that they're close to. And they have worked in some of the most forbidding areas, including during the siege of Al-Fashir, which lasted, which was very intense for about 9 months and lasted for about 500 days, when we were unable to get there. And so we provided them assistance and help and support, financial support from afar, but they were the ones basically doing the work in the most difficult circumstances. And I think that exemplifies, the spirit and the strength of the Sudanese to me. I mean, it's true, the country has been a tragedy, but we shouldn't reduce the people of Sudan to those tragic circumstances. They're not all tragedies themselves. They have their own agency, their own capacity, and they, including the people that work for us, are incredibly strong people that I learn a lot from. And I'm not just saying that to be correct. It is self-evidently true. It's my experience. But yeah, we've also had circumstances during which, after the fall of Fashion, all the atrocities that that came out and that were put out on social media by RSF soldiers themselves. We had people crying in our office. Their friends and their loved ones, they were still stuck in Fashion. To this day, they don't know whether they will come back, and they get threatening messages over Facebook of their family members being held by militias or soldiers, being tortured, sometimes even by children, and with the message, if you don't pay up, then they won't be able to come home safe. So yeah, it's that contradiction and that combination which makes Sudan terrifying, and on the one hand, but also a very important and relevant to me, and to my organization and to Yanti's organization, Place to Work In.
Well, and Yanti, you spoke earlier that you also have staff on the ground in Sudan. What have you heard from them?
Oh, we hear from them, regularly, and it's true what Ryan says. I mean, the vast majority of our staff are Sudanese. All of our staff in Darfur for now are Sudanese, because it's been so difficult to get people to come in and out again. So yeah, they have the most horrifying stories. They sometimes don't know where their family members are. They've gone missing, unaccounted for. Sometimes communications is hard to keep up. So yes, they're all themselves impacted, and yet they will go out every day to make sure that they can do whatever they can to help their communities. And Aaron's story about these emergency rooms, it's within our humanitarian sector, it's really a well-known phenomenon that level of community support and competence and skills and unbelievable creativity to make do with not enough, but figure out a way to eke out enough assistance for everybody, even though you have these unbelievable circumstances under which you have to do the work, is that is a real thing, and we are trying to support them. It's also how you can support. How you can deliver assistance, sometimes really efficiently, and when you can't even get to the area, you give them cash, and they are able to do the most remarkable things, and to support themselves with the most urgent needs that they sort of experience.
Well, when we talk about urgent needs, oftentimes we think about the physical needs, obviously very important, like food, medical supplies, etc. But very few times, but we talk about this a lot when we talk about humanitarian aid, is the focus on mental health, especially with the organization focusing on children. So can you talk about the mental health needs in Sudan, especially for kids?
And it is massive, and you're right, Catherine. There's always this, I always find this is some bizarre conversation about what is really life-saving. Is it water, food, or, how can education be life-saving? And Save the Children has always been very clear about that. Education is life-saving for children, especially because it really impacts also their mental health. We're not talking about just learning your times tables or learning how to read and write, although that is also life-saving. But it is also mental health. We've got, 40 million kids, I think, have been out of school certainly for the last 2 years. So that lack of an in-person engagement with kids your age, your friends, and learning and feeling that you have an ability to read and write, but to also then, take care of yourself or be better able to take care of yourself. The lack of that is unbelievably impactful for the mental health. Aside from, the violence that they've witnessed and the fact that their family members are being raped, and the fact that they don't have any food. So it is, as always, any crisis is always also a mental health crisis, which lingers long after, even after. Look, if we get at some point to a ceasefire here and a peace process, which is still, to some extent elusive, I think. But, we can't give up hope on that. But after that, really supporting that piece during and after a crisis is very important. We are running to the best of our abilities, even in Darfur, what we call child-friendly spaces. Those are essentially, sometimes it's like a tent under a tree, where we have children together, where they can actually be children. They can play and sing and dance and do whatever kids do. As we all know, when they get together, there is still unbelievable. I always find these places wherever I go in a crisis and you are in a child-friendly space, kids are the same the world over. There's laughter, there's boisterous sort of behavior, there's, jumping up and down, there's dancing. But it's also a place where we do have trauma-informed care, where you do have counselors who can start to help children deal with some of the things that they've witnessed that no child should ever see.
Right. Well, we talk a lot about the support for the children, of course, in this case, but what about support for your staff? Are they getting the counseling that they need or the support that they need?
And it's super hard, and I'm sure, Arjen will corroborate this. I mean, we try. We give staff support, not just, of course, the support as being an employee of Save the Children, but you also try to give them mental health support. Sometimes that has to happen online because it's hard to reach everybody. So we try to do it to the best of our abilities. We've got employee support services that are available to people. Also, it's really important, humanitarians in particular, it's 24/7, right? There is hardly any reprieve, and people feel that they can't take the rest that they sometimes need to take because there is so much to do and there's never enough, and children are dying, etc. So you want to jump out of bed and work 24/7 to do it. And sometimes you do have to almost force people to take a break or to take care of their mental health before they can take care of others. And that is a constant balance for our, particularly for our leaders, our managers in places like this.
Well, and Arjen, I would love to pose the same question to you too, as you're trying to balance that, if balance is possible in those impossible moments, how do you take care of yourself?
So I think we're falling far short of what is required in order to be able to support our staff, and this is our Sudanese colleagues in particular. Our international colleagues are also living and working under the most extreme circumstances. But our Sudanese colleagues are affected by the conflict themselves. They're affected by multiple displacement. Their family members. They take care of their extended family, their friends. They hear of people going missing, family members being raped, people being detained and being kept hostage for ransom. And so they experience this not only over the last month, but not only over the last year, but over the last 20 years. And so we are. One of the things I came back with the other time, we had a particularly tough time after the fall of Fasher, and with a number of incidents that happened in Darfur at the time. And we had that discussion with our staff. We have a staff support person, psychologist, who basically speaks to people online. But we need to, I think, go much further, and we're now having discussions about having a duty of care manager, somebody who's basically dedicated in the team itself in order to provide that support to people who are basically living through that misery and that crisis every single day, and who are working incredibly hard on the other hand, and they try to support their communities and their country. But we need to do more in order to be able to support them, and this is one way. We haven't started yet. We've just today decided to basically start to recruit for that position, and we're hoping that will at least provide some minimal continuous, because we tend to basically respond to incidents and then we say, okay, you need to have support. But here we need to have sort of a continuous system of support available for our Sudanese colleagues.
You've been listening to Arjen Heenkamp, who's the crisis lead for Sudan with the International Rescue Committee, and Yanti Suripto, who is the president and CEO of Save the Children, and they will both be staying with us after the break. Let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The ongoing civil war in Sudan has caused massive levels of suffering. Sexual violence, starvation, and displacement have devastated the region. With us today to give us a better understanding is Ariane Hehenkamp with International Rescue Committee and Yanti Suripto of Save the Children. So Yanti, I want to jump back to you here. Sudan is not the only humanitarian crisis happening around the globe, and you have joined us previously on Where We Live to talk about the ongoing crisis in Palestine. What are other crises that you would like our listeners to know about and to be aware of?
Yeah, sadly, Catherine, it's a bit of a, as we say, misery Olympic. So that list is too long and too intense. So Gaza, Palestine is still absolutely far from over. We still see massive impediments to delivering aid at scale into Gaza. We still have supplies stuck in warehouses and at the border, and even sometimes when it gets in, it is, it doesn't mean it necessarily gets delivered. Shots get put into arms, food gets given to communities who desperately need it. So that is definitely one. I would also call out Ukraine. People sort of think, oh, it's a while ago, is it still going? Ukraine had its deadliest month in July of this year since the start of the war. Right, more than 3,000 children have been killed. Aside from a massive impact, of course, on adult civilians. So the fighting is intensified. There's targeting of civilians now, explicit targeting of civilians in the border areas or at the where the line is in Donetsk and Kharkiv. And again, huge displacement because people are fleeing or being pushed out of those areas. So again, we're back to real basic response to people being displaced. So, they lack access to food, shelter, and water and everything else. On top of the fact that, of course, Ukrainian children have now been, out of their formal school system for many, many years, certainly if you add in the pandemic. So Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan are certainly the hotspots. Sudan, in terms of numbers of people, I think currently counts as the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, but it doesn't mean that the impact and the intensity of the need in those other crises is not important. And then, perhaps if I have to pick one other, if you let me one other, I would call out the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly in the east. Again, we see a multitude of highly weaponized military actors. They're fighting it out over essentially, rare minerals. And of course, again, the civilian population, and particularly children, are bearing the brunt of that fight. So we see millions displaced, no access to food, shelter, and water. I was there last year. Those were some of the most dire displacement camps that I've ever seen, where it was massive unmet need, makeshift shelter on these lava sort of rocks that you couldn't even, there was literally not even a flat surface inside, where people sort of were stuck. And we saw literally shelling going over their heads from one side of the mountain to the other, where militant groups were essentially, taking shots at each other. And of course, once in a while, things end up in the middle of a camp full of kids and civilians. So that's my top list.
Well, I was just going to say, Ariane, Yanti, of course, just scraped the surface of places that have dire needs of support. And as people are listening to this, and as we continue to learn more about all of these crises, what can people do to support efforts to bring aid to Sudan and support those impacted by the civil war? Ariane.
Yeah. IRC, just to say that IRC publishes a watch list, a crisis watch list every year, and Sudan has been on the top of it together with Gaza. But also places like Haiti and Myanmar, they don't get a lot of attention, but they should, alongside, of course, Sudan. Now, in terms of your question, I think, Sudan seems very, very far away for people in Connecticut or, people in my country in Holland. But there's things that you can do. In particular, I think anyone anywhere can contact their congressperson or their member of parliament in order to be able to raise concern in parliaments themselves. Very often it's the parliaments or the Congress that basically makes the executive prioritize a certain context. And so for Sudan, definitely, if people feel outraged and concerned about this, then contact your member of Congress. What you can do is you can donate to IRC, to Save the Children, to any organization that you find credible and legitimate and impactful. You can consider giving directly through a number of organizations too. Maybe even consider giving to the ERRs. I don't know how that would be done in a direct manner, however. I think to share and to talk and to talk about Sudan and to share information about the crisis in Sudan is a third way in which people can try and focus an attention on the situation in Sudan.
Well, Yanti, we got about a minute here, but we'd love to ask too, because we've talked about how a lot of humanitarian aid organizations have been impacted by federal funding cuts, and there's still so much work to do. How does this impact your work in Sudan and other places where these crises still exist?
Well, it impacted us massively. There's no doubt about it, because we've seen, we ourselves saw a 30% reduction because of it. And of course, because it happened so disruptively, it is really difficult to then try to bridge all of those gaps in one go, notwithstanding huge efforts to do so. And thankfully, a lot of enormously generous private individuals and foundations and families and organizations who really stepped up and stepped into the breach here. But again, I think, this whole hour we've been talking about mostly Sudan and some of these other crises, and I can't fault people for thinking, oh my God, this is all hopeless, and what can one person do? And I think that is our biggest risk. I think as a global community, as a local community, that you lose hope, because in the end, we all know that the actions that, yes, IRC, Save the Children, other humanitarians are taking, or the local communities themselves are taking, those actions actually do matter. They matter for those communities that we reach. Yes, they're nowhere near enough. I would love to reach, 5 times more communities than we do currently in Sudan, 10 times more probably. But for those that we do reach, it does matter. And those actions also create hope for those communities and also for ourselves. And I think, and it's hard to do that when you're indeed 10,000 miles away sitting in Connecticut, but there is always something you can do, right? By really internalizing, this is happening to women and girls and children in Sudan, but they're like my children and my neighbors and my family here in Connecticut. And as Arjen says, contact your local legislators, post about it on social media. Don't let these things fall off the radar because they're far away and they're seemingly intractable.
Well, thank you so much for landing us on hope during this conversation today. You've been listening to Yanti Saripto, who's the president and CEO of Save the Children, that's based here in Connecticut. Yanti, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
And Arjan Hehenkamp, who is with the International Rescue Committee. Arjan, really appreciate you sharing your stories with us today as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
And speaking of thanks, today is Giving Tuesday, where We Live relies on listener generosity for every episode that we bring you, including today's hour. Your support is so important. We cannot emphasize that more, especially with Connecticut Public's recent loss of $2.1 million in federal funding. So if you haven't already, please consider making a donation today. Check out our website at ctpublic.org. You can play a big role in making this a Giving Tuesday we'll never forget, and we thank you ahead of time. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you all so much for giving.